Hey guys. Oh, sorry. Welcome to Bitcoin country. That is the theme of my speech today. And as the mainstream media might refer to it, welcome to the failed Bitcoin experiment. I'm sure you guys have read the numerous headlines telling you that Bitcoin has failed in El Salvador. And I want to leave you guys with one thing today to shift your mindset on how you view how Bitcoin is impacting El Salvador. For the first thing, I look around here today and I see people from all over the world, and I also see way more Salvadorans here than we saw in the first year. So I love the fact that we're seeing local adoption, but not just that. People from around the world are uprooting, they're leaving everything, they're moving here. I've had the privilege of doing a podcast for the last couple of years and having a number of people and sit down and hear their stories about how they sold everything in Canada and left after they saw what was happening with the trucker protest and just how crazy their government was. People from Europe who feel like there's no future there and they see the hope in El Salvador. And so I want to get those of you who are thinking about that and are thinking about moving here to really realize the promise that is happening here, and also help you understand why there's the disconnect, because this is something I've been processing. I've been here for the last 20 years, and the last 3 or 4 years, you see El Salvador just winning in everything. It's just amazing to see the growth, the construction that's happening everywhere, the foreign investment that's coming in, everything that is happening since Bitcoin adoption. And then you turn to the articles written about El Salvador, and they talk about how it's failing. And I was struggling with this disconnect of, I know the media likes to lie about things, but how could they be so blind to what is really happening here? And I think that the problem is they don't understand Bitcoin, and they don't understand how Bitcoin impacts individuals, but also can impact countries. So I want you to think about a couple things. The first thing that they really focused on when they were talking about Bitcoin being failure here was the technical challenges. Anytime you have a rollout of something new, there's going to be technical challenges. And once we kind of went through there, they started focusing on price. And every time the price of Bitcoin would drop, they would talk about how much El Salvador had lost. I'm sure you realize they don't talk about that anymore. They're not talking about how much El Salvador is up on their Bitcoin investments, which is fine for me because I don't think that is really the important thing, or how Bitcoin has really helped El Salvador. So the thing that now they focus on is how much usage is happening. And they talk about it's only a small percentage of the transactions that are actually happening in Bitcoin. And that is true. We still have a long way to go. And I've told people from the beginning, this is a decade plus long transformation. We've seen that with credit cards. When they came in, they took decades to really take root. Even Apple Pay, when it first started, people called it a failure because in the first couple of years it had very little uptake. Now you go around the world and it's the primary way that young people pay for things. So I want to kind of reset the expectation. So I'm going to take you back to the meeting we had with the Minister of the Economy 3 years ago, when we were pitching this insane idea to her to bring to the president for them to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. We promised that it would have 4 things that would happen, and none of them were really around transactions. None of them were around number go up. They were things that were more broadly and deeply impact the economy. The first thing we told them, it will change the brand of El Salvador. At that time, when you talked about El Salvador, they thought about the highest murder rate in the world, and they thought about gang violence. And we told her, with this single action that won't actually cost the government any money, you can transform the image of El Salvador from a backwater that's violent and full of poverty to a future-looking society that's embracing the newest technology and financial system. And you can change the whole brand of El Salvador. And if you were to try to hire a publicity company to do this same thing, it would cost you billions of dollars and you would still probably be unsuccessful. But you can do this one thing and it will transform the country. And we have seen that happen. We have seen the world focus their eyes on El Salvador. Many of you here probably didn't even know where El Salvador was on the map 3 or 4 years ago. Now you're sitting here. And so El Salvador has become a beacon of hope in the world. We've seen press from around the world descend on it. Think about the value of the earned media of just the 60 Minutes segment that was done on El Salvador, showing the beautiful beaches, showing the smiling faces. And the great part is even when the media wants to do hit pieces, they still can't resist putting pictures of the beautiful beaches and the other things here. And so we have this influx of people and into the economy. The other thing is that we promised was that this would put El Salvador and the president into the history books. What other way could the president or leader of a small country be of historical importance in the world? A place that was been mired in poverty and violence. We told them, if they make this decision, he will go down on the history books and he will change the trajectory of El Salvador. We've seen that happen. We promised them that tourism would go up tenfold over the next decade if they adopted this. And we've seen that. Most of you here are here specifically because of Bitcoin, but it's not just the people directly impacted by coming directly for Bitcoin. It's also the secondary impact of people seeing these media accounts and showing the beautiful beaches, showing the mountains, all the beauty here. And so we've seen El Salvador tourism increase by high double digits every year since adoption, even as the rest of the world has struggled post-COVID with tourism. And finally, we promised that investment would flow into the country. And we've seen that. We've seen the number of companies that are coming in, not just Bitcoin companies, but companies from the tech space, companies from the financial space, even construction companies, as we're seeing this huge growth here in El Salvador. And so these are ways that Bitcoin is impacting the country that the media will never talk to you about. But I want to take you even beyond that, about how Bitcoin adoption has really impacted the soul of El Salvador. So most of you as Bitcoiners realize the myriad of ways that Bitcoin infiltrates and impacts your life. And really the financial transactions and the number go up is not how really Bitcoin impacts you. That's a small part of it. It changes the way you look at health. It changes the way it lowers your time preferences, we like to say. It makes you think about the long term. It makes you think not even about your own future, about your kids' future. And we're seeing the same thing happen here in El Salvador. And I want to give you just a couple examples. One is on the health side. Going into COVID, El Salvador was still on the fiat standard. And we saw a pretty disastrous, from my opinion, lockdown here. It was very strict. They locked people in their homes. They did a lot of things that were unhealthy. But between then and the first Adopting Bitcoin conference, El Salvador adopted Bitcoin. And that started changing the way people in government thought about things. So that in fact, during the first Adopting Bitcoin conference, mid-conference, you had the president make a declaration on Twitter, middle of the day, that they were no longer going to require COVID tests to come into the country. And they did that because of this conference, because people were having a hard time getting in for the conference with delayed flights and other things. Their COVID tests had expired. And they realized if we want to attract Bitcoiners, we need to embrace freedom and need to be smart about health concerns. And so it wasn't just that. They also, some of you remember seeing the video that they put out. As other countries were ratcheting down and locking people in their homes, they put out a video encouraging people to get out, exercise, to eat healthy, to do healthy things. And so we saw how the adopting of Bitcoin transformed the way the government thought about health. More recently, we've seen that when it comes to government budget. Historically, El Salvador has lived way beyond their means. They've been dependent on IMF loans and other people to come in and subsidize because they've always lived way beyond what they brought in tax revenue. And the president recently made the shocking announcement that they were no longer going to do that. They were going to be wise about the way that they addressed their finances. And they actually proposed a budget where this year they plan on spending 10% less at the government level than they did last year. 10% less. Most governments, when they talk about cutting back on spending, what they really mean is instead of increasing our spending by 10%, we're going to increase it by 8%, and we're going to call it a cutback. Here, they're actually putting into place a 10% reduction in the government budget. Even before the US now seems to be trying to follow in El Salvador's footsteps. They're focused on on bringing efficiencies into the government economy. You know, you've heard recently Elon Musk coming in. I won't talk about the name they've chosen for the department, but to bring government efficiency in and to cut waste. El Salvador has already been doing that. They've significantly reduced the number of bureaucrats, the number of politicians by consolidating districts, by trying to bring savings in, and they're able to actually cut their budget by 10%. And so we are seeing all these different ways that adopting Bitcoin is transforming the way this government interacts with its people, the way that it embraces free speech. They've been one of the biggest proponents of free speech and telling people, hey, if you're concerned about the government where you live silencing you and not allowing you to speak up, come to El Salvador, because it is going to be a haven for free speech. All of these things, I believe, can trace their roots back to the adoption of Bitcoin, of them deciding they were not going to rely on the corrupt fiat system, but they were going to adopt the world's hardest money. And if they were going to do that, there was going to be consequences of that. And so they realized to continue to attract Bitcoiners, they need to embrace self-sovereignty and promote that in the population. They need to embrace freedom. They need to embrace sound budgets, because they can't continue in the ways of old, because Bitcoiners won't come. And they really have latched their wagon to Bitcoin. They know that this is vital, that this has to succeed. They have to attract the brightest and the best from around the world to help make this transformation in El Salvador. And so I'm so thankful to see all of you guys out there that are part of this revolution. A lot of you have chosen to live here. So I'm going to leave you with this thing. When the media talks about Bitcoin having failed, I want you to reflect back on your own life and how Bitcoin has changed life for you, but also how long that took. These things are not, for most of us, I know for myself, this journey has been 10 years plus for me to really understand Bitcoin. So for me to think that the people here in El Salvador are going to understand it and embrace it overnight would be silly. They're on the same journey that we've all been on. For most of them, they're in their first Bitcoin cycle. And so we need to look at this in the long term, that maybe sometimes we get discouraged and think that the uptake is slow. But I actually have been shocked at how quickly things have gone, that this is a place where you can live on a Bitcoin standard. You can live only spending Bitcoin. There's nowhere else in the place in the world where you can do that. And this is a country where 5 years ago, hardly anybody had ever heard of Bitcoin. So welcome to Bitcoin country. Get out and spend your Bitcoin. Get down to Bitcoin Beach and see the amazing things that are happening there in the circular economy. And start really thinking hard about where you want your kids to grow up. Do you want them to grow up in a country that is embracing freedom, or a country that is going in the other direction? So welcome to El Salvador.